now look to the Member of Secretaries Committee, Brendan McGrath, Oriel College, to continue the case for the proposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, I had planned to make this speech the launch of my own presidential campaign. But at the last minute, I was persuaded not to. Apparently, the Treasurer didn't want the student to become the master too quickly. In September 2011, two members of the Occupy Wall Street movement scratched off a letter to President Obama listing their demands. They said, "Hey, babe, we want regulations tightened, high-frequency trading banned, and all the financial fraudsters of the 2008 crash arrested. We're going to stay in our Liberty Plaza until these demands are met." I think it was a public park or something. Occupy Wall Street was just the purest form of a message that we hear every day. That not only did bankers screw up, they're bad people. They ruined everything, and they left us to pay for it. They're greedy, they're shameless, and they need to be stopped. Ladies and gentlemen, my central point is that the act of blaming is not an academic moral evaluation. It's a substantive act that we make as society. It's something we do, and in 2008, it's something we did. And I want you to remember this, so I'm going to say it slowly and pretend like I mean it. We made the deliberate and self-conscious decision to speak as one voice and say, "You did this to me, you took my job, you took my home, you did it." This debate is about the consequences of that decision. Now, look, I know it looks like we're on the nasty side of this debate, but I promise that we're not, okay? I agree that bankers behaved immorally, in some cases illegally, and that the crisis definitely would not have happened if they did not do this. But here's my argument. After the crash, our anger had to be directed somewhere, right? But when we decided that that anger would go towards the individual moral character of bankers, we secured the conclusion that that influence would go completely to waste. Our limited influence on policy became a push for so-called reforms which would punish bankers with no understandings of the ways in which banks actually threaten society, no understanding of the ways in which banks can be made a more open, more inclusive, more responsive social institution. Ladies and gentlemen, as was observed in the recent edition of the Cherwell newspaper, I am desperate for attention. So I'm sure you won't be surprised, and the Honourable Treasurer least of all, that I really want to win this debate, okay? I just hope it's not too obvious that the Secretary and I have already cut a deal to trade votes for each other tonight. I have 3 points for you, ladies and gentlemen, tonight. First, bankers just want to have managerial discretion, by Cyndi Lauper. Second, an alternative movement I oppose: Occupy mortgage interest deductions. Third, why don't you like me? A love letter from the Dodd-Frank Act. And I realize during this speech that finance can get a bit dry, so I have prepared a list of jokes for this evening. And the only points of information that I'm going to accept tonight will be requests for me to read out one of these jokes.
Point of information?
No, thank you, it's too early. My first point starts like this. Our vilification of banks puts pressure on the government, but it puts pressure for the wrong reforms, ones which are punitive, ones which are aimed at constraining the individual discretion of bankers, ones aimed at punishing them for their past misdeeds. Crucially, this pressure for the wrong reforms crowds out pressure for the genuinely necessary ones. The protesters of Occupy Wall Street had 3 clear demands. They wanted legal limits on executive pay, they wanted to levy a Robin Hood tax on financial transactions, and they wanted to indict those executives responsible for the financial crisis. Now, let's call a spade here. These aren't reforms, these are punishments. And I'm not saying that those involved don't deserve punishment. I'm saying that if we genuinely want to recover from the crisis and want to avoid the next one, we need to look beyond punishment. We need to look to systematic, structural reform. And the dynamic protests that the Treasurer mentions in his speech, according to my argument, are directed at precisely the wrong thing. They're precisely counterproductive. The Occupy Wall Street movement is the exact example of pushing for the wrong reforms. And all this wouldn't have been a problem, right? If we'd gotten both. If we'd gotten the guilty held accountable, and if we had gotten structural reform. But we didn't. Because let's remember why we're all here, right? It's because Wall Street is really, really good at rigging the system in its favor. This is because it doesn't matter how many public parks you've occupied. There are only so many hours in the day for you to fight for reform. In contrast, Wall Street's sole purpose is to make money. Every action it takes is directed at fighting financial regulation that's going to reduce its profit margins. If this goal of profit maximization is threatened by any public pressure, there's an entire international mechanism that gets put into place to fight that change. They lobby, they infiltrate regulators, and they fund deregulating politicians. I feel a bit like a conspiracy theorist saying this, but there genuinely is an international elite that's conspiring to screw us all over to protect its own privilege, right? After my term on the Oxford Union Committee, I'm starting to believe that more and more. But the bottom line is, Wall Street is powerful. There's only so much policy that we can sneak by it. We should have used the wiggle room such as we had it to sneak in those genuinely systematic, risk-reducing, accountability-increasing reforms. Instead, we push for these individual moral punishments which don't help and which crowd out those reforms. The salary cuts, the Robin Hood taxes, the indictments. That was my first point. Here's my second, right? Government bodies did loads of terrible things that helped to cause the crash. I think Molly covered this really well. It would have been really useful if we'd had a stronger narrative blaming those government bodies for all the crap that they did, right? Because these terrible things are often still in force. Now, this is a big claim that I'm making, but as I've learned to do in my politics essay, I'm going to justify it using one example, okay? The financial crisis was only a crisis because everybody had way too much debt. So asset prices tanked, which would have been bad, but everyone was way over leveraged, had taken out too many loans, so it was a catastrophe. Well, what if I told you that the US government was the driving force behind all this debt? Okay? Here's how. It's called the mortgage interest deduction, okay? The US tax code lets people write off the interest on their mortgage, and it lets companies write off the interest on their corporate loans. Now, this makes heavy borrowing incredibly easy and encourages a huge debt bias. I'm also in my first week of macroeconomics, just for the record. So people run up their mortgages, they shrink the size of their down payments. And this is like a smoking gun, because we all agree that too much debt caused a financial crisis. And this is literally the government inducing people to borrow. And this thing still exists. This is exactly the kind of thing that we should be outraged about, that we should be occupying public parks for. But no, it still exists. It's still in place. And the next crisis is made even more dangerous. So sum up this point. Blaming Wall Street has left less energy to blame government, so government can keep getting away with ignoring its past mistakes and shying away from the structural problems which endanger the entire economy. Ladies and gentlemen, our time together is almost up, and I'm as sad about that as you are relieved. So it's time for my third point, and this is the Dodd-Frank Act and me, a one-woman show. See, bank bashing is really easy to do, and politicians love to do it. But when we reward them for doing it, we give them the cover they need to gut the financial regulations that reduce risk. Here's my one example this time. The Trump administration is doing two weirdly contradictory things. It's talking about reviving this Glass-Steagall Act that we've heard from the first two speakers, but simultaneously it's talking about gutting the Dodd-Frank Act, the one that was put in place after the crisis. Now, let's get the tinfoil hats on to try and understand this. Glass-Steagall is about putting a wall between commercial and investment banking, as the speaker said. The original aim at the time was to block some sort of banking scam that was going on at the time. So talking about reviving it fits really nicely with the public mood of, oh, down with bankers, we hate them. But this reform was made in literally a different century. I think the financial sector is quite a bit different now than it was in the 1930s and the 1940s. And this means that the scam that the Glass-Steagall Act is meant to stop just literally doesn't exist anymore. In contrast, the Dodd-Frank Act is the most up-to-date version of financial regulation exists. And so Republicans can just throw a bit of red meat at the public who hates banks. They can say, we're going to bring the Glass-Steagall Act back, but don't look twice. We're also going to literally repeal the Dodd-Frank Act. So structural change isn't sexy, and it has nothing to do with blaming Wall Street. So we forget about the government corruption, which was the true cause of the crisis. Now, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, those are the only arguments I have. We regret blaming Wall Street for the crisis because it was not, sorry, no one has asked me for a joke, and I find that really insulting. Yes, please.
When you say one of your jokes.
Oh, yes. What do you get when central banks print money to buy fixed quantities of brie, camembert, and cheddar? Quantitative cheesing. We regret blaming Wall Street for the crash because it was not a useful way to spend our political capital. Bankers were blameworthy in principle, but so were plenty of other actors. The point is, deciding to blame bankers is far less useful than deciding to blame government. I think that's a clear choice. Ladies and gentlemen, I will sit down soon. And I'll be honest, I want to win, but there are more important things. And so, on a more serious note, I'd just like to say that this vote will go on one side or the other, but whichever one it goes to, I'd like to say that, Madam Secretary, Mr. Treasurer, it's been an absolute privilege and a pleasure to work with both of you and to speak alongside you. Thank you.